There is an image you have probably seen since you were small. A delicate winged girl in a glittering dress, sitting on a flower, granting wishes. She is kind. She is harmless. She is the friend of all children. This is a fairy. You learn this from cartoons, from bedtime stories, from the pink aisle of every toy store on earth. Now hold that image in your mind for one more second. Then I want you to look at this. This is a woodcut from the year 1827, printed in Ireland. It shows a thin, withered creature with the face of an old man and the body of an infant, lying in a wooden crib. The mother stands over it, with an iron fire poker in her hand. She is preparing to burn the thing in the crib because she is certain it is not her baby. For 1,500 years across Europe, parents believed that what you are looking at right now was a real, daily threat. They were not entirely wrong. From the Nix Codex, page 2, opens tonight. Tonight we walk into the oldest fear in European folklore. Not the fear of demons, not the fear of witches, the fear of fairies. And by the end of this entry, you will understand why your great-great-grandmother, somewhere in her village in Ireland or Scotland or Cornwall or the Black Forest, slept with iron scissors under her newborn's cradle, with salt in a line across the doorway, with red thread tied around the baby's wrist and a Bible open on the chest of drawers. She was not being superstitious. She was defending her child from 5 specific things that her own grandmother had told her about. Tonight, you will learn all 5. And this is what they actually did. The first disturbance is the oldest one. The fairies came at night, when the parents were asleep, and they took the human baby out of its cradle. In its place, they put one of their own. Their own children were sickly, often deformed, often dying. The fairy folk could not heal them in their underground world, and so they used a simple trade. They took a strong human infant. They left their weak fairy infant. The mother woke in the morning, looked into the cradle, and saw what looked almost like her baby. Almost. The eyes were wrong. The skin was thin and grey. The cry was harsh and unending. The infant refused to eat or grew thin no matter how much it was fed. This was the changeling. And the parents knew, with a certainty modern people cannot understand, that their real child had been stolen. The historical record on this is not vague. It is documented. The coroner's records of County Tipperary, Ireland, contain a case from 1895. A young woman named Bridget Cleary became ill with what we now know was probably bronchitis. Her husband Michael, her aunt, her cousins, her father, and the local fairy doctor became convinced that the fairies had taken the real Bridget and left a changeling in her place. They held her over the fire. They forced her to drink herbal mixtures. They demanded that she say her name 3 times. When the changeling, as they saw it, refused to answer correctly, they set her on fire. She burned to death in front of her family. They were genuinely surprised when Bridget did not come back from under the fairy hill afterward. The trial transcripts are public record. The husband was convicted of manslaughter, not murder, because the court accepted that he had genuinely believed his wife was a fairy substitute. This was not in the Dark Ages. This was 1895. A woman was burned alive for being a fairy in Ireland less than 30 years before commercial radio. And Bridget Cleary was not isolated. In Wales, in the year 1864, the body of a small child was found in a river near Caernarfon. The mother had drowned the child after a wise woman told her it was a changeling. The coroner ruled it accidental death. In Scotland, in 1843, a Glasgow woman named Margaret Lang held her infant daughter over a peat fire for 15 minutes to make the changeling jump out of her. The baby died. The mother was sent to a poorhouse, not prison, because the magistrate accepted that she had acted out of folk belief. In Germany, in the same century, several documented cases of mothers placing their infants on hot baking shovels and pushing them into the oven for a moment, because the folk wisdom said that a changeling, faced with fire, would fly up the chimney and the real child would be returned in its place. Sometimes the babies died. The records do not always say. In the Isle of Skye, in 1794, a man named Donald MacLeod left his 3-week-old son unattended for 15 minutes while he fed the goats. When he returned, the baby was crying differently. The man became convinced, over the next several days, that this was no longer his son. He took the infant to a sea cliff and held it over the edge, calling on the fairies to take their child back and return his. He stood there for an hour. The infant grew silent. The man, weeping, eventually carried the baby home and accepted, in his own words written down by a parish minister years later, that the fairies had refused the trade and his real son was lost forever. He raised the child he no longer believed was his own for the rest of his life. He never loved the boy. The boy grew into a quiet man who hanged himself at the age of 27, leaving a single sentence in a note. "My father never met me." The fairy folklore had killed that family across 2 generations. Across the Pyrenees, in the Basque country, the changeling was called the cuckoo. In Iceland, it was called the umskiptingur. In Brittany, it was the corrigan. In Russia, it was the obmenish. Every European culture had a word for this specific fear, a specific term for the wrong infant in the cradle. That alone should tell you something. When 40 different languages independently develop a specific noun for the same supernatural phenomenon, you are not looking at imagination. You are looking at a real, persistent pattern in how human parents have processed the unbearable. The unbearable, in this case, being a child who came into the world wrong, or who became wrong shortly after birth. The fairies explained it. The fairies were responsible. And the fairies could, with the right ritual, be persuaded to take the changeling back. Now, modern medicine looks back at these cases and sees something else. Many of the children diagnosed as changelings would today be recognized as autistic, or born with cerebral palsy, or suffering from failure to thrive syndrome, or any number of conditions that cause an infant to not develop at the expected pace. The folk diagnosis was changeling. The folk treatment was violence. The connection between fairy belief and historical child abuse is direct, documented, and devastating. Every disabled child born into a small European village before the modern era was at real risk of being identified as a fairy substitute and killed in an attempt to retrieve the supposed real child. That is the first disturbance. That is what your ancestors actually believed and actually did, and this is what they actually did next. The second disturbance is much older than the first, and it comes from the deepest layer of Celtic folk theology. The fairies, in the original belief, were not separate from hell. They had a contract with hell. Every 7 years, the underground folk had to pay a tithe to the Lord of the Underworld. This was called the Tíðindi. The payment was not gold, it was not grain, it was a soul, a living, breathing soul, taken from the human world above. The fairies needed bodies to pay the tithe, and they took children whenever they could, because children's souls were considered the most valuable and the easiest to extract. The Ballad of Tam Lin, written down in Scotland in 1549, but believed to be many centuries older, describes this exactly. Tam Lin was a human knight who fell into the hands of the fairy queen. She kept him as her consort. He was beautiful. He was strong, and he was content to live in the fairy world for years. But every 7 years the tithe was due, and Tam Lin knew with absolute certainty that this time the fairy queen would offer him, not out of cruelty, out of necessity. The contract had to be paid. The human girl Janet, who loved him, had to rescue him by holding on to him through every transformation the fairy queen could perform. Burning coal, raging serpent, lion, hot iron, until the queen ran out of magic and released him. The ballad survives in over 50 variants across Scotland and northern England. It was sung at firesides for 400 years. Children grew up knowing that the fairies might one day owe the tithe, and a strong, fair child was the kind of payment most likely to be accepted. This belief existed across the entire British Isles. In Cornwall, the tithe was thought to fall on the eve of Samhain. Families with newborn children would not leave their cottages on that night. In Ireland, the tithe was associated with the Lugnasad harvest festival in August. Older women would walk the perimeter of the field where the babies played, sprinkling iron filings and salt. In Wales, the tithe was associated with the change between Beltane and Midsummer. Welsh folk records describe mothers tying their infants to themselves, with red string for the entire week, sleeping with the child against their breast, refusing to set them down even for a moment, because the snatchers were on their 7-year rounds. And the strangest part is this: the folk did not consider the fairies evil for doing this. The fairies were paying a debt. They had no choice. The fairies were not malicious. They were prisoners of a contract older than human history. And the price of being a prisoner of that contract was the occasional human child, taken at night, taken silently, taken with the family, never knowing what had happened until they noticed the baby was unusually quiet in the morning, and then realized, slowly, with growing horror, that the unusual quiet was because the body in the cradle was not breathing at all. There is a particularly disturbing record from the parish of Aberfoyle in Scotland, written by the minister Robert Kirk in 1691. He documented the deaths of 3 infants in the same village during a single 7-year cycle, all of whom died in their cradles on nights when the wind blew from the west. The villagers were certain these were tithe deaths. They believed the fairies had reached up through the floor of the cottage, touched the child once, and taken the soul without leaving any mark on the body. The mothers, in each case, said the same thing the next morning. They said the cradle had felt colder than it should. They said the air in the room had a smell like wet stone. They said they had dreamed, in the night, of small figures gathered around the cradle, lifting something invisible out of the baby's chest. 3 families in one village, 1 cycle of years, and every family afterward, for the next 7 years, slept with iron under the bed. The 7-year cycle was not random. It corresponded to ancient Celtic time reckoning, where 7 was the number of completion for a worldly cycle. The harvest year had its own 7. The human lifespan was thought to operate in 7-year stages, and the tithe was the dark mirror of those cycles. What is given is taken back. What rises must descend. The 7-year tithe was the cost of having a magical world adjacent to the human one. The fairies, in the folk imagination, were not free creatures. They had bought their immortality, their beauty, their music, their feasting, by signing a contract that required regular human sacrifice. They were, in this sense, almost pitiable. They wanted the children no more than the parents wanted to lose them, but the contract had to be paid, and so it was. And this is what they actually did next. The third disturbance comes from a different category of fairy tale entirely. It is about time, about how time works under the hills, and how it does not match the time on the surface. The fairy mounds, called Sidhay in Ireland, were real places. They are still standing. You can drive to many of them today. They are Neolithic burial mounds, thousands of years old, scattered across the British Isles and Brittany. The Celts knew these mounds were old before the Celts arrived. They believed the mounds were the doors to the fairy world, and they believed that time underneath the mounds ran differently than time on the surface. A child who entered the mound for an afternoon would come out 100 years later. The folk records on this are numerous and disturbingly consistent. In County Kerry, Ireland, there is the story of a boy named Diarmid who chased a deer into a hillside crack in the year 1670. He came out 3 days later, by his own counting. The villagers did not recognize him. His parents were long dead. His siblings were old men and women in their 90s. He had been gone, by surface time, for 97 years. He aged 70 years overnight when he tried to eat ordinary bread, and he died within the week. In the Outer Hebrides, the ballad of the Wee Wee Man tells of a child who follows a small stranger into a green hill for what feels like a single dance. He emerges into a world he no longer knows. His clothing has rotted on his back. His mother is buried in the churchyard. The fiddler who played for him in the hill is long dead by surface time. The Wee Wee Man laughs and pushes him out, and the door in the hill closes forever. These stories were not entertainment. They were warnings. Specific warnings. They were the way that medieval Europe explained the disappearance of children. A child who vanished into the woods was assumed to have entered a fairy mound. The body was never found, because the body was, in folk belief, still alive, but living on different time. Sometimes, said the old stories, the child would emerge, sometimes as an old man who could no longer speak the language of his birth village, sometimes as bones, dropped at the doorstep of the family cottage a century later, sometimes as a ghost, glimpsed at the edge of the harvest fields on summer nights, walking and not aging, trying to find his way home through a world that no longer remembered him. In Welsh folklore, there is a recurring figure called the Returner. The Returner is a child who entered the fairy world and emerged unchanged in body, but completely changed in mind. The Returner could not eat. The returner could not sleep through a single night. The returner had no interest in human company. The returner did not recognize their own siblings. They sat by windows. They stared at hills. They walked towards stone circles when no one was watching them. The folk wisdom said that the body had returned, but the soul was still trapped in the fairy time, dancing forever at a feast that, by surface measurement, would last only a few minutes. The folk solution to a returner was patience and confinement. The family would keep the returner locked indoors, fed by force if necessary, until either the soul came back to rejoin the body or the body wasted away from grief. Most returners, in the folk records, eventually walked back into the hills and were never seen again. The family considered this a small mercy. Better that the body should rejoin the soul than that the body should starve to death on the doorstep of the home it could no longer recognize. There is a particular Scottish tale, recorded in 1810 by Robert Kirk in his manuscript, The Secret Commonwealth, in which a man returns from 20 years inside the mound. He is the same age he was when he entered, but everything inside him has changed. He cannot eat human food. He cannot sleep in a human bed. He cannot bear the touch of another person. He walks to the edge of the village every night and stares at the hill where he came from. 3 months later, he walks back into the hill and is never seen again. The fairies, the story says, do not let you go all the way. They take a piece of you. And the piece they keep is the part that knows how to be alive on the surface. And this is what they actually did next. The fourth disturbance is the most subtle and the most psychologically frightening of the 5. The fairies, in the deepest layer of European belief, did not always take the child's body. Sometimes they took only the soul. They left the body behind. They left the shell of skin and bone that could still eat, still breathe, still walk, still cry, and even still speak. But there was nothing inside it. The child you raised after the hollowing was not your child. It was an empty form that wore your child's face. This was called the hollowing or the soul snatching, depending on the region. How would a parent know if this had happened? The signs were specific and were taught down through generations of Irish, Welsh, and German folk wisdom. The hollow child would refuse to look at religious objects. The hollow child would not laugh, even when amused. The hollow child would speak with strange phrasing, sometimes saying things that no child their age should know, sometimes responding to questions with answers that came from a much older mind. The hollow child would have nightmares of the same dream every night, often involving a hill, a green door, and a small voice calling them back. The hollow child would grow into a difficult adult, restless, prone to depression, unable to settle in any village, drawn to forests and water and high places. The folk diagnosis was that the soul was still trapped in the fairy world, and the body was just walking around the surface, waiting, until one day the body, too, would walk back into a hill and rejoin its soul. Then the family would lose them entirely. When modern researchers look back at the folk records of hollowed children, the medical correlations are uncomfortable. Many of the symptoms describe what we would now call autism spectrum disorder, severe attachment disruption from infant illness, or what 19th century doctors called melancholia, and we now call major depression. There is also a strong correlation with sudden infant death syndrome. A mother whose baby died in its sleep, with no apparent cause, would not accept that her baby had simply died. She would tell herself that the fairies had taken its soul during the night, and the body had died because there was nothing inside it anymore. This was the way grieving mothers across Europe survived the inexplicable death of a child. The fairies took her, the body is empty. My real child is in the hill, and is happy, and someday I will join her there. It was a folk theology of grief. It was kinder in some ways than the modern silence we offer to parents in the same situation today. But the hollowing also licensed cruelty. A difficult child, an autistic child, a child who simply did not match the village's expectations, could be diagnosed as hollow. The parents could withdraw affection, the community could withdraw care. The child could be left to wander, to starve, to die at the edge of the woods, on the theory that the body would soon walk back into the hill and the soul would be reunited with itself. The fairy folklore provided a justification for abandoning children who did not fit. That is the second face of the hollowing. The kind one is the grief mother. The cruel one is the village that decided your child no longer counted as fully human, and this is what they actually did last. The fifth disturbance is the one that breaks every assumption you have about fairy lore so far. Because so far, every disturbance has had the fairies as the villains and the human parents as the victims. The fifth disturbance reverses that. The fifth disturbance is the trade, the deliberate, considered, transactional offering of a human child by the parents themselves. The records are clear about this, and they exist in multiple regions. In Welsh folk customs, there are documented practices called the changeling pact, where a family with too many children, or a child the family found difficult to raise, would perform a ritual at a fairy mound to deliberately offer the child in exchange for prosperity. A new field that suddenly produced rich harvests. A cow that suddenly gave milk in winter. A daughter who suddenly married the rich neighboring farmer. In each of these cases, folk wisdom traced the prosperity back to a child who had vanished a few years earlier. The trade had been accepted. The family thrived. In Cornish folklore, similar customs are described. A family with a sick or troublesome child would leave it overnight on a fairy stone, with the understanding that the fairies would take it and leave gold or grain or good fortune in its place. Sometimes the child would simply be gone in the morning. Sometimes the body would be found dead at the foot of the stone and the family would receive their gift anyway, as if the fairies considered the dead body acceptable payment. These customs were never universal. They were always shameful. They were always whispered about, never openly discussed. But the folklorist Wirt Sykes, writing in 1880 about Welsh customs, recorded more than 30 separate accounts of children traded to the fairies by their own families. He treated the accounts as folk fiction. Modern historians are less certain. The pattern of child mortality in certain Welsh and Cornish villages during the 18th century includes a number of unexplained disappearances that line up too neatly with subsequent sudden family prosperity to be entirely innocent. We cannot prove that the fairies took these children. We can suspect that the parents did. The fairy story was the cover. The fairy mound was where the body went. The fairies were the explanation that made the unthinkable thinkable. This was the dark transactional underside of the fairy belief, and almost nobody talks about it today, because it does not fit the modern image of the wee folk at all. So how did we go from this? From infanticide, from blood tithes, from time-stolen souls, from hollowed bodies, from parents who traded children for gold, to the pink-winged Disney fairy in a glittering dress sitting on a flower. The reframe took less than 100 years, and it happened almost entirely in Victorian England. In the year 1830, fairies were still terrifying creatures that rural parents protected their children from with iron and salt. By the year 1920, fairies were considered charming, harmless, almost comic, and ideal for children's books and Christmas cards. The transformation was driven by three things. The first was the Victorian middle-class hunger for a sanitized rural fantasy. They wanted a countryside they could romanticize, not a countryside that still scared them. The second was the deliberate work of children's authors like Andrew Lang and George MacDonald, who collected the old folk tales and rewrote them for nursery audiences, deliberately removing the violence, the sexual elements, and the genuine horror. The third, and most decisive, was the Cottingley Fairies hoax of 1917. Two young girls in Yorkshire produced photographs of themselves apparently posing with small winged figures. The photographs were fake. The figures were paper cutouts. But Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes, publicly endorsed the photographs as real, and overnight the entire English-speaking world fell in love with the idea of small, friendly, charming fairies. By the time Tinkerbell appeared in Peter Pan, the original folk terror had been thoroughly buried. Within 2 generations, no parent in Europe was protecting a baby with iron scissors anymore. The fear had been forgotten. The economic dimension of this sanitization is rarely discussed, but is critical. By the late 1800s, a new market had emerged. The middle-class child. For the first time in European history, ordinary families had disposable income to spend on toys, books, and decorations specifically for their children. Publishers and toy makers needed safe content. Terrifying fairies who stole infants were not commercially viable. Soft, glittering fairies who granted wishes were extremely commercially viable. The market made the choice. The fairy was rewritten by the same logic that has since rewritten witches into Halloween candy, vampires into teenage romance, and demons into action movie villains. Whatever could be sold to a parent for a child was kept. Whatever could not be sold was buried. The original fairy was unsellable, so she was edited out of existence in the public imagination, replaced with a creature who looks superficially similar but functions entirely differently. The new fairy is a service worker. She grants wishes. She helps lost children. She befriends the lonely. The old fairy was a predator. The new fairy is a customer service representative for the magical world. There has never been a more dramatic example of folklore being repackaged for commercial consumption. But forgetting is not the same as erasing. The Victorian fairy is a costume. Underneath the costume, the original creature is still there, in the deepest layer of the folklore, waiting in the mound, demanding the 7-year tithe, hollowing the children who are left alone too long at twilight. Modern parents do not know why they feel uneasy about leaving an infant alone in a dim room. They do not know why iron scissors next to a cradle is an old folk practice. They do not know why salt at a threshold was once protective. They do not know why a red string on a baby's wrist was, in the Hebrew tradition, in the Slavic tradition, in the Celtic tradition, considered a necessity. They have inherited only the actions, not the reasons. They feel the reasons in their bones, in the small primitive part of the brain that still remembers, but they cannot name what they are protecting their children from. They have been taught it is nothing. They have been taught it is just superstition. The original disturbances have been folded under the surface of modern parenting, like a bloodstain folded under a clean tablecloth. The tablecloth is white, but the stain is still there, just under the surface, and on certain nights, in certain houses, when the wind blows a certain way through a child's bedroom window, the stain shows through. This entry is sealed. Some doors should not have been opened. You now know what your great-great-grandmother actually feared when she warned you, in stories you barely remember, not to take anything offered to you by strangers in the woods. You now know why she put iron at the threshold. You now know why she would not let the baby be photographed before its baptism. You now know why she said, when a child was unusually quiet, that the child was off with the fairies. And you now know that this phrase was never the harmless idiom you thought it was. It was a diagnosis. It was a warning. It was the oldest fear in European parenting, expressed in the gentlest possible language, so that the children listening would not have nightmares. You have nightmares now, perhaps, or you will, tonight. The fairies have not left. They have only been redressed in glitter and given a more marketable smile. Underneath, the mound is still there. The 7-year tithe is still being paid by someone. The hollow children still walk among us. And somewhere in the British Isles tonight, an old woman who knows what her grandmother taught her is laying iron scissors beside a newborn's cradle, just in case. If you have a child, look once at where they sleep tonight. Look at the corners of the room. Look at the window. Look at the threshold. Ask yourself which of these things you have been quietly protecting them from without knowing why. The instinct is older than you are. The instinct is older than your grandmother. The instinct goes back to the first European parents who buried their dead beneath the mounds and learned, generations later, that what came out of those mounds was no longer entirely on their side. Some doors in history should not have been opened. The Codex returns. Page 3 is already waiting, and on page 3, an entity we have all seen on ancient artifacts but never properly named is about to be named, and once named, you will see it everywhere. In museum displays, in classical sculptures, in temple carvings, and you will wonder how no one has ever told you what it actually was.